Good morning to those of you in the United States, and good afternoon to folks in Europe, and well, good evening if you're in Asia. My name is Jeff Rathke. I'm the president of the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies at Johns Hopkins University, and I'm really glad to welcome you to this event, which is part of a series of discussions we've been conducting with leading economic thinkers from the private sector, from the scholarly community, and with senior government officials. We're really pleased today to host this webinar with the chief economist of Allianz, Ludovic Subran. And the title, as you saw, is Globalization Beyond the Pandemic, More, Less, or Just Different. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic is a public health crisis that is also a crisis of the global economy. And for the past 2 weeks following the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, questions of racial justice are gripping the United States in profound ways, with reverberations elsewhere in the world. Now, the economic response to the pandemic has involved far-reaching fiscal stimulus measures at the national level and in the European Union. It's also brought about renewed scrutiny of globalization, some concerned about the vulnerability of supply chains to disruption, talking about nearshoring. For others, it's a matter of trade policy or industrial policy. And there are those looking at globalization through a geopolitical lens, especially with regard to China. So this is a tremendous opportunity to hear the thoughts of Ludovic Subran and engage in a discussion. And I'm going to turn it over now to my colleague, Senior Fellow Peter Rashish, who directs the Geoeconomics program at AICGS, to introduce our speaker and to moderate the session. Peter, over to you.
Thank you, Jeff. Let me join you in welcoming Ludovic Subran and also welcoming all of you to our webinar today. As Jeff mentioned, Ludovic is the chief economist of Allianz, which is the largest insurance company in Europe. He's also the chief economist of Euler Hermes, which is a leading credit insurance company. Ludovic is French. He works for one company that is based in Munich and one company that is based in Paris. So you could say in a certain way he personifies this dynamism that we are once again seeing at the heart of the French and Franco-German relationship these days. But Ludovic is beyond Europe. He's also had a global career. He has worked for the United Nations, for the World Bank, and in 30 countries around the world. And his topic today is eminently globalization after the pandemic, more or less or just different. Just to set this scene briefly, and to pick up on what Jeff said, we used to hear a lot about offshoring, about companies investing in or moving production overseas. And now we're hearing a lot about reshoring, in other words, bringing production home. We're also hearing about nearshoring, about a kind of regionalization of production. In other words, we're hearing about making globalization less global. And that would be done in the name of greater security, greater resilience in a crisis. But we might also ask, what, if any, economic costs could be involved in those kinds of shifts, whatever the other benefits they would bring? And I think really we could have no one better than Ludovic today to help us understand these issues and other ones. Ludovic will speak for about 20 minutes. After that, we will open it up to your questions. If you could please use the Q&A button on your Zoom screen, that would help us to do that, and we'll aim to wrap up by about 10:45. So Ludovic, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Jeff. It's a pleasure to present today. I wished I had been with you, physically in DC like we planned initially, but this is the life after the virus. Travels will certainly be a big impediment to globalization as we knew it before, but hopefully not for so long, because travel still burdens the mind. So I will make a few introductory remarks to talk about this globalization after the pandemic. And of course, I will come to your point, Peter, about reshoring, because I will talk from a French-German perspective. Reshoring is on top of the agenda of the policymakers. The presidency of the European Union is with Germany as of July 1st, and everything is about sovereignty. Everything is about industrial autonomy, and therefore reshoring, from aeronautics all the way to cars to green cars, all the way to services also, is something that Eastern European countries, but also France and Germany want to discuss very heavily. So I will talk about that and see what it means. So the first, I mean, four things to start the conversation. The first thing is, the trade is massively affected by coronavirus. The first phase of coronavirus, in instance, basically when China went into crisis, but also when the seclusion crisis happens around the world, we were at peak, losing close to 30 billion USD of trade per week. So all in all, in 2020, even if we have some what we call a U recovery, but basically a prolonged situation of below potential activity, we're going to have maybe $2.5 to $3 trillion of trade losses in 2020. And of course, it's massive. It's twice as severe as 2008, 2009, and it comes with a very different flavor, which is we didn't have the credit crunch because of the very prompt and very massive policy reaction, both by central banks and ministries of finance. We don't have the credit crunch or the tightening of trade financing as we've seen in 2009. That warranted basically this very asymmetric recovery, whereby in 2010, most of trade, actually the bulk of the recovery in trade was originating from China. This time around, we don't have this trade squeeze on the financing side, but we have a real trade squeeze on the supply chain, on the real economy. We have a real demand issue, outlets problem because of the recession, which is very severe. And we have, which is very important, a backdrop that was very fragile, which is the US-China rivalry. And all in all, today, without the US-China trade deal, tariffs around the world are at the level that they were in the mid-90s. So they're close to 8, 9, 10%, depending on how you look at tariffs globally. So the bounce back from trade that we've seen in 2008, 2009, 2010, right? This V shape is going to be a more complex V shape when it comes to global trade because of this underlying situation of protectionism, rampant protectionism that was existing before the crisis, and which of course gets worse as we go along because of uncooperative policies, but also because of different types of protectionism. A lot of people are worried about regulatory aftershocks or some type of regulatory difficulties related to sanitary protocols, but also more generally to the fact that non-tariff based barriers, trade barriers, will actually mushroom after the crisis. Norms, be it, for example, if Europe wants to be the only one heralding a green recovery compared to the US and China, or be indeed for hidden protectionism reasons. We've seen that already in the medical equipment. Of course, it was quite a nightmare to see borders closed on medical equipment when emerging markets were the most affected. I was actually personally very shocked to see the international community spend so much time discussing debt in the emerging market, but not discussing the issue of critical imports when it came to medical equipment. But more importantly, we already see the beginning of the aftertaste when it comes to investment protection. So CFIUS equivalent around the world have been strengthened right at in the middle of this crisis to avoid the shopping spree of the countries that would be first in, first out, especially the Asian countries. So in my country, France, or in Germany, the Außenwirtschaftsverordnung, which is the CFIUS equivalent, has been strengthened to include in the list of sectors that require, for some type of stake acquisition, the okay from government, anything related to biotechs and most importantly, I think in the future it will be basically all the tech sector, because of the fear, that all the money that has been poured into bridging the gap, the cash flow gap, the employment gap of this crisis will actually all for nothing, because control would be shifted towards Asia just because of a calendar issue, which is the way the pandemics actually affected countries in a sequential way. So that's very important to understand, that the trade rebound will be very very different from what we experienced in 2010, in spite of quite a substantial demand recovery, at least from what we expect. We still have the world growing 3% in 2021 after close to 4% recession. But indeed, the question is how local or or said differently, how import intensive this recovery will be. I will come to the reshoring point. I just want to make a second point about the rest of globalization, because people often think globalization as goods, but there is also globalization in services. As a global brand, it's something that is very dear to our hearts. That's why I always mention these regulatory constraints we face and we are worried about in the future, because for services, it has always been a different game altogether. It's been about complying with local authorities, and it's been about converging norms, and trying to make sure that financial services especially will continue to be global. And of course we see that this crisis will be, because of the financial shock that it entailed, certainly will call for very different measures on both sides of the pond. For example, President Trump already talked about deregulation on the banking sector. As I said here, we're talking a bit more about regulating, for example, some of the insurance issues that may have not been regulated before. And more generally, I think what is interesting in this crisis from a European perspective is that I have the impression that it's the first time that the euro is behaving as a currency that actually owns its exorbitant privilege. Because the ECB has been very bold, because of the French-German initiatives, I have the impression that Europe is in a very different situation than it was in 2010. We're going to have a very asymmetric recovery from country to country because of how strict the lockdown were, or how the industrial base may play a role in the rebound. But we somehow have had, a bit of a Hamiltonian moment, and this is important for the financial side of globalization, for cash flows. And that's why I talk about exorbitant privilege. I have the impression that somehow the globalization after the crisis will certainly be revealing or exemplifying this idea of three currency basins, the dollar basin, the euro basin, and the renminbi basin. And for the first time, I have the impression that Europe is ready to fight for internationalization of the euro. And so that will certainly change also, the idea of the euro as a reserve currency, but more importantly, how the euro could actually be more used as a currency for payment, as a currency for trade, and for trade financing. We've been shying away from this in the beginning, or at least in the first 30 years of the euro, maybe the 20 years if you take it from the beginning of the 2000. But now I have the impression that there is a push just by pooling debt, but also this idea of having a central bank that is ready to go much further than it has ever gone before, and certainly trying to finance the recovery, even though it's out of the mandate. And we see that on both sides of the pond. We see central banks being a critical role in the fiscal policies that are unleashed, and that will certainly play, a different that will drive the globalization recovery differently. For example, in Europe, people talk about a Buy European Act much more aggressively than before, because they know that the public procurement will be supported somehow by very loose monetary and financial conditions, or at least very cheap financial conditions. And so I believe that for Europe, at least, it looks like the Thucydides trap that we were in before has changed. And so that will certainly have an effect on how the financial actors of Europe, including us as an investor and as an insurer, look at the recovery, look at the way we want to finance growth. I believe that for a very long time, we have been focused on the current account surplus, which has been a massive topic of discussion. And today, I have the impression we understand that a strong euro is not bad after all, especially if we can play with that to be an international financier in different places of the world, because we have all this cash at hand, and we certainly see different movements in the cross-border financing flows, including in Europe or within Europe. But when it comes to Europe going after, for example, critical investments in the UK, in spite of Brexit, or Europe looking at investing further in Asia or supporting investment further in Asia. Just if you look at the instruments that have been deployed, credit insurance has been one of the segments that has been massively supported by governments in Europe, from France to Germany to Italy to even the UK, but also Romania. There's been a lot of money put in place to make sure that European companies will be supported in going after clients, being locally or abroad, and so the working capital will be financed in very cheap conditions. So it's not only about the big finance, but also the small finance. Third, if you just look at what's happening today, there is an inventory edge in trade. So if you have had inventory stocks, you are today winning market shares. So the supply and demand constraints of this purgatory, this twilight zone in which we are, gives a comparative advantage to those companies that have had high inventories and that are therefore not threatened by supply constraints. And it gives, as I said, a bit of an advantage to those companies that are accompanied to continue to go abroad, either because the country is very competitive. Most of Europe has decided to use partial unemployment schemes and are therefore dumped socially and certainly cost-wise the competitiveness of products manufactured in Europe. We just need to acknowledge this. And so this is something that is going to be, of course, we're going to look into this and the effect of that in the years to come, because we will never know if it works or not just now. But it's very interesting to see that in practice today, we have a lot of fiscal, social, and somehow, competitiveness tweaks that come from the emergency policies that have been put in place by governments. So depending on what your government did, you have or not the higher chances, for example, to be more competitive on the outset of the crisis. So you have right now a boulevard when it comes to being the sole supplier that could actually be meeting the demand somewhere else. And I think this is a very interesting moment, because we have been in a price blurring mode for quite some time. Just look at how capital markets are behaving. And so for trade, we also start to see little by little what happens when the tide goes out, and especially those companies that have had a lot of stocks before and that are now unleashing this, edge on the market. Those companies that are very smart at using some of the public policies that were supposed to be emergency, but that are overwhelming their stay, and partial employment or guaranteed loans in Europe is one of them. And those companies, and we see that a lot in China, that are extra supported by the public sector, which has decided to socialize most of the costs of this recovery. And so it is going to be a very uneven moment for global companies, where governments are going to be tampering with business practices for time to come, but it starts now. And so I just want to explain that, or to raise the attention that we're going to have much stronger governments. A lot of people talk about state capitalism. I think the word is a bit strong, but clearly what we see is that governments have been putting a lot of cash into solving companies at any cost. And so this deep pocket syndrome is something that is going to be with us for quite some time, including on incentivizing companies to hoard cash. But it is also a big springboard for a lot of companies that wanted to venture outside of their borders. And so I think for me that is going to be something, we don't know the effects yet, but it is certainly something that creates a Darwinian effect on companies, depending on their location, depending on their sectors, and so forth. Of course, this point about it is not necessarily the same for some of the sectors that are particularly affected by the crisis. I'm talking, of course, about travel, air transportation, and aeronautics. But for some of the sectors, especially electronics, automotive, machinery and equipment, but also agri-food, etc. There is this moment where some of these policies are actually used as a competitiveness edge. And if you tie them with the stocks that some of these companies have been piling up before because of the low momentum of growth, then there is something happening. And basically order books in German companies, for example, are back to pre-crisis level already in a lot of sectors. And even interestingly, for some of you that are interested, because of the drop in revenue, you have a lot of companies that have inverted working capital requirements and that become banks that finance the recovery of some of the suppliers. So there is a lot of solidarity, I would say, within supply chains to finance the recovery. And so as a result, the first elements we have on order books are quite good at this point. And the last point is indeed the reshoring, because it's high on the agenda. So you hear a lot of arguments, of course, on the economic side. I'm not a big fan of reshoring because I'm always worried about the scope of such thing, and the fact that one of the benefits of globalization has been, at least in the first phase, lower prices for all. And then, of course, there was the negative effects of globalization, which was this when the factors of production moved from one country to another. My country, France, was a big loser in that game compared to Germany, for example. And so going forward, of course, a lot of people are doing demand side stimulus. Very few countries are talking about supply side reforms, which is an issue. I mean, at least for me, I see that the procrastinating some of the creative destruction in some sectors is a problem. Zombifying some companies is a problem. And of course, you add on to this the very politicized argument about reshoring, about sovereignty, about industrial autonomy, and this call for a lesser dependence on China, which is not really against China per se, but it's more about the fear of being hyper dependent on sole suppliers, which actually is an issue. I think we impose stress tests on banks and insurance companies, but we don't impose a logistics stress test on companies. And so we've seen during this crisis that some companies were in a very difficult situation, including with critical medical equipment, to just source them. And I think this has, this is a good political momentum, at least, to talk about reshoring. But I think we should be very, very transparent about the cost of that, especially for the final consumer, and for the further zombification of some of the companies. So on the pros, what you hear all the time on why companies should reshore, it's because it creates resilience, it lowers the risk, then the lead time. For strategic sectors, it should be like the military, so it shouldn't be a market per se, it should be control economy. It's how you prepare the EU for the future, with being less naive, less in this Thucydides trap, at least being the millions of Thucydides in the Peloponnese War, where we just look at US and China like that, we regain some type of sovereignty or autonomy. Local supply creates more agility, more responsive to changing conditions. You're closer to the customer, so you have a better satisfaction. We hear all of these arguments being told all over again, especially on the French side, and it has contaminated the German side, which is a bit of a problem, because it was a bit, the balance between my French and my German brain was always that the French wanted super champions in Europe, and Germany was always about laissez-faire and horizontal market industrial policies. Now it seems that everybody is contaminated, and we're gonna have quite a ride on trying to limit a little bit the appetite of governments to be very influential in some spheres of the manufacturing sector. Especially, you've seen about the car industry is a big issue, of course, because it's very job intensive basically, and so it is a political battlefield. We also have in Europe this story that it will also help with the integration of the Eastern European countries, because of course, if reshoring there is, a lot of the Central Eastern European countries will benefit from it, at least on some of the supply chains. It's already the case in the car industry, but it could also be the case in chemicals, and to a certain extent also in the machinery and equipment. But and to finish off, I still, we need to think about how pragmatic this type of reshoring will be. How do you manage reshoring when there is a risk of social discontent linked to higher higher prices? How do you manage reshoring when it doesn't necessarily mean de-risking, because you're going to have excess concentration, and certainly for some companies, it will cap somehow the profits. A lot of governments are conditioning and targeting the aid they're giving to some type of either green constraints, which I can understand. It's a principled recovery we want in Europe, but it could also actually cap a little bit the profit making by decreasing the universe of investment or the universe in which you play when it comes to M&A or strategic development or geographical development. And so I think it will certainly, as I said before, temper a bit with the hard laws of a market economy. And so we need to really think what is at stake here for the surplus. We have a very heavy discussion right now about wage subsidies in Europe to avoid a second wave, which is much more important than the first epidemic wave, which is the unemployment wave, because we didn't get the unemployment wave that you guys got in the US. And so there is a lot of discussion about this, and the costs per job saved of putting these jobs in a dormant status is something that we should very clearly explain and have a discussion like that country by country. Third, it is hardly reversible for many sectors or at a very high cost. You can move the soloist, but you cannot move the orchestra. It takes 15 years. Most academic papers on this show that it takes decades to get the know-how transferred from one place to the other. In my country, France, the industrial sectors has been dismantled over the past 15 years massively. And I don't think that any demand side policy will actually boost the productive investment, especially because the capacity of production don't exist anymore. I come from the southwest of France. You cannot find a machine to make pâté, anywhere but in China these days. And so if you want to create a pâté company out of nowhere, you have to go and buy it in China because you cannot find the production capacity. I mean, the physical equipment to do it in the right way. The incentives for businesses to reshore are still lacking or too general. And so I wonder if people are serious about the money. We spend dozens of billions on the emergency aid. We're spending another 50 billion in France and Germany for the phase 2 of the virus, which is this twilight zone. But are we ready to put yet another 4 or 5% of GDP, which is what Germany put in the recovery today, to reshore? I'm not sure about that. The last thing I want to say is, reshoring goods is a good idea, but nobody talks about services. And I personally have the intuition that in services where you had a lot already of trends of robotization and outsourcing, these are jobs we should also try to protect then if we want to protect goods or if we want to reshore industrial production. And so are we ready to put all of this money to safeguard jobs at any cost when other companies or other countries are trying to actually lower their cost base as we speak? Japan gives a subsidy for reshoring to companies. ASEAN countries are trying to think about wage subsidies to keep being in the supply chain in some of these countries. So if we start with goods, okay, we're going to reshore some jobs. It's going to be a hidden wage subsidy. What happened with services? Because people see people working from home, and so they think, okay, maybe I don't need. They don't need so much social capital to perform their duty. Why don't we outsource some of these jobs in the service sector after having outsourced some of the jobs in the manufacturing sector? That was already happening before. We saw that right when the UK prepared for Brexit. Most of the companies actually used Brexit as an excuse to basically reduce the job intensity of some of these sectors. So I'm very worried about the temptation to over administer globalization after the crisis, and that we forget that in the end it's the price that matters, and that there will be at one point an issue with who has to pay, and are people willing, so the consent to pay for a made in Germany products, which may be 10%, 15% more expensive than a made global with local content requirements for Germany product. And I'm not sure that it will be explained this way now by policymakers because of the hyper-politicization the US, China, Europe conundrum that we've seen, which is a political and international relation issue. And I think it is used a bit too much to tweak or to divert some of the economic and financial flows that should actually restart a bit like they were before the crisis, should the government learn to actually unplug the wires of life support that they've wired so far.
Well, Ludovic, thank you very much for that rich presentation, which I think offers a lot to think about. If I could kick things off, I was fascinated by what you said about how this time is different for the euro. And especially what you said about the likelihood that the euro could be seen more through a global financing lens and have more of a role that way, and that its importance in trade might lose some, might go down a bit. And I think what might be interesting, if you wanted to speculate about some of the political ramifications of that. What I mean is that looking at the euro principally as a way to facilitate international trade, then, as you suggested, then you would want to have a lower value of the euro that benefits manufacturing countries like Germany, some others in Europe. But if you look at it through a global financing lens, that may shift around the balance of power in the EU, but I also wonder how that would shift around the balance of power transatlantically, because you suggest that if it had a greater role in global finance, you'd want to have a stronger euro. And of course, one of the complaints is that, to the extent this is important to think about, the bilateral deficit between the US and the EU may in part be caused by the low value of the euro. So I want to know if you wanted to look a little bit at what the political consequences of that could be.
I mean, President Trump was the first one to start talking about currency manipulation and to list some countries in the Eurozone as currency manipulators. And it was actually very funny, of course, to see that he listed only some countries. I mean, it's not him, it's the Treasury, but he listed only some countries. And unfortunately, we are one currency. So I never understood why, for example, Germany was on the list, but my country, France, was not on the list. I was a bit jealous that he didn't know we shared the same currency. But so you're right. The issue of the politicization, I mean, people have been talking about currency war for quite some time. And I think we need to understand that, what's happening on the central banking side will be solved on the exchange rate market. The fact that the Fed is going overboard, buying fallen angels, and, that central banks' balance sheet are exploding, the fact that the European Central Bank is doing the same, in the end, I'm not a big believer in the return of inflation for many reasons. We could actually talk about that because it's a big issue. But if you just look at the structural drivers of exchange rate between Europe and the US, there was, of course, growth differential. Right now, we're both in the pit. There was current account differential. We still have a massive current account surplus to the US when you count goods. It's more or less a tie when it comes to goods and services. But what was different was the monetary policy and how accommodative or how loose it would be. And today, it's very hard to say who is the loosest between the losers between the US and Europe, because both central banks went to uncharted territories to suppress volatility. And we can discuss whether, in the history books, we will remember this as having saved the financial markets instead of having saved the economy. That's a different topic. But, so the euro-dollar exchange rate is going to be the topic. And it is even more of an issue because for us, what will it be? I don't know if it's going to be 1.12 or 1.14. It's very hard to say because it is about fiscal differences will play a role. We've seen that when President Trump passed the Homer Patrician Act. It is about what type of product we will sell, what type of ambition we have for internationalization of our companies. But more importantly, I'm concerned about those countries that don't have this exorbitant privilege, especially the emerging markets, because they cannot have their central banks do QE and infinity like we do. They cannot have, they don't have the signature that we benefit. And so I believe that they're going to have to peg themselves even more to some of these big currency bases. And this is going to be, a de facto cluster approach to globalization. And so everybody is it's going to be like the slices of an orange. The US is going to look south to Latin America, Europe is going to look south to Africa, and China is going to look south to ASEAN. And this is going to be how the clusters of globalization are going to organize themselves. China has been looking at this facility payment for the renminbi for quite some time, including all the way to Africa and Latin America. But de facto gravity will matter in how globalization will be formed. And so I don't know if it's going to be a US against Euro type of issue, or it's going to be about the commodity market of the Americas compared to, I don't know, the manufacturing markets of Europe and Africa. This for me is a big unknown, but in the short run, I'm sure that we're going to see a lot more movements on currencies globally. And on the euro dollar, we're going to see as monetary policy normalize, because they will somehow normalize one day. I wonder whether we will see, we've seen a lot of rallying towards the USD, especially in the first phase. It was actually one of the biggest issue with President Trump's policy, is that the fiercer the rivalry with China, the stronger the USD, and because of the fiscal stimulus, the deeper or the wider the current account deficit, and more abundantly, the lower the American competitiveness, right? But going forward, because of this extra loose monetary policy, again, when this monetary tsunami is gonna retreat, this is when we're gonna see what is left of the fundamentals of this euro dollar exchange rate. And today it's a bit early to call the shots, but I wouldn't be surprised that we see a change because of more ring fencing, for example, from European investors, because of failed attempt at reshoring some activities, and therefore overblown current accounts. That are the type of concern that I have today. And of course, we're going to see the risk of policy mistakes when you temper with trade policy are huge, especially when you don't have a COP, right? I mean, the WTO is useless. And so the more you are in the situation where it's a bigger than neighbor policy, the more you are in a situation where, it's very hard to have some type of convergence, the end of big free trade agreements, because, you add too many constraints and the greed and the inclusion and so forth. It makes the situation of, for companies especially, very complicated, because you have to organize your supply chains differently. And therefore, I wouldn't be surprised that, for example, in Germany, the ambition is very clear. Germany wants to focus on European outlets. The reason why Germany is okay with the debt proposal is because Germany understands that in this world, you have to secure your European outlets. So Germany is okay with very profligate demand style policy, Germany, of course, to get out of the pit, but with the rest of Europe at the expense of the German taxpayer, because it understands that most of the outlets, Germany has a responsibility to repair and strengthen regional supply chains, because this is a survival issue for most of the companies in Germany. And instead of trying to do it across the globe, Germany has decided to start with the Italian and the French and the Spanish consumers, and the Dutch and the Belgium. And I think this will for sure change, certainly indeed reduce the current account surplus of Germany with the rest of the world, if they find a local consumer that is in the first phase artificially stimulated, but in the midterm maybe actually has pulled itself by its bootstrap and is indeed a very faithful customer without needing, and one other thing that, to add to this, before the crisis, I heard so many CEOs in Germany talk about the needs to choose a scenario between the US and China, because it is, for some of them, their debt is in dollar, but their customer base is in Asia and so forth. Today, I hear less of this needs to choose scenario, or at least the need to choose scenario between US and China is, I need to choose between Europe and the rest of the world.
Thanks, Ludovic. We have a question from Ana Herrero from the Washington Post. It's a two-part question. She wants to know what the effect of work from home, and maybe I could add to that, sort of the virtual economy is having on the market and global economy. You know, will that be a growth phase, area for the economy? And then she also wants to know what the would like to know what the effect of the crisis will be on developing countries specifically.
On what? Sorry, I didn't hear
on
that.
Developing countries specifically.
On developing countries. I mean, on the first one, it's a very, I mean, nobody knows. So you hear so many, I mean, you read so many articles of people telling you it's a dogmatic, we will know really later. I mean, some in the management literature, you see a lot, you know, about flexibility. So it's all about indeed, you increase your employer brand and you increase satisfaction by allowing flexibility. But this is, you know, this optionality aspect of the location of your work and work-life balance literature. This type of crisis where there is an economic argument because, you know, is a worker worth more or less than the square meters that it occupies in a tower, in a business center? That's a major question for economists, and I don't think we have the answer yet. We see dogmatic answers, so people saying, you know, it's wonderful, you know, everybody can work from home, it's going to be amazing. Okay, fine, but people need to read the small print, you know, the tiny script, because for Facebook, for example, it's all about adjusting your salary based on your zip code. So it's a benefits issue. It's about how much your employer can adjust your compensation based on your location. So it is de facto outsourcing without the benefit of social capital. So what you create at ideating together, at understanding the company's culture together, and I think it will actually, and we will realize that it actually caps mobility and promotion opportunities. So yeah, you will be kept in the job, but what type of opportunities will be passed by you if you don't know what's happening in the company, or if you cannot raise your hand if you hear about a good project passing by? I don't know the answer to this, and I'm very, I wouldn't say cynical, but I'm very cautious about the black and white stories I hear about home office, because, you know, the virus has created a big anxiety shock. A lot of the workers are in PTSD. It's not the PTSD of going to war, but, you know, not knowing if you could be sick or if your coworker could give you a disease. It is something that is massive. And you mentioned it in the introduction, the US is still in this phase, and it is a big stress. And that's why, you know, most companies have opted on trust, as, you know, and trust has replaced rules, and it has empowered a lot of the employees. And I think it has unleashed a lot of productivity from commute and from the stress. But the question is the midterm cursor. Where do you put it between an organized workplace and a completely, you know, gig economy square, where people can work from anywhere and it's going to be okay, and we're going to all collectively take responsibility for the loss of productivity? I mean, the time spent in a day aligning or solving misunderstandings or adding the additional hour of work in coordinating something that takes 5 minutes in the office, nobody talks about that one. So I'm, you know, so that's a big puzzle for me. And so I think, more importantly, it will question, I think, or it will, this virus seems to, I don't know, to be a big inequality revealer. And so I believe that some of the trends that existed before the crisis, especially in the service sector, where we saw a lot of the small banking branch being reduced, or we saw, like, you know, this call for productivity in the service sector, often productivity is a bit lower because you're less exposed to international competition, right? Because you're a non-tradable sector, especially in the non-financial services. Of course, you know, if you're a local hairdresser, it's even more obvious, and so this may not go. But the question is more, what type of jobs will be at risk because they were more distant from the epicenter? I always was a big believer that the higher the distance of the job, the higher the propensity to robotize or outsource. And so the question is whether this work from home is a temporary distance that you put between you and your job, or is it a structural distance, and what is the cost of this structural distance on your overall employability within the firm, or the need of this job to stay where you are with you. And indeed, it's a question of value added of the specific job. But I think I have the impression also that the social protection system is behind, right? So we tend, and it's everywhere the same problem, we tend to protect the job instead of protecting the worker. And I think we absolutely need, all of us, in the US in particular because of the very high unemployment rate, but also in Europe because it's just postponed, to continue to invest massively in upskilling, in active labor market policies, because this is what will make the worker stronger and create more value added than, you know, outsourcing it in Mauritius, in India, or in Europe. It's all about Hungary and Romania today. On the second topic, on developing economies, you know, of course, the pandemic is evolving as we speak. So we see hotspots like Brazil, and you know, depending, there is a gradient linked to the strictness of confinement. But what shocked me the most is the two-tier situation, whereby emerging markets have been failed by the Bretton Woods institution. I think the capacity to respond from the IMF and the World Bank, and the discussion with, let's say, the North has not gone into the right direction, in the North and include China on bilateral debt. I think we've seen, or we're going to see a lot more difficulties for some of these large emerging markets. We've seen already a wave of default before the crisis, from Lebanon to Ecuador to Argentina. So we see that being an issue. Commodity exporters are also at risk, the Bahrain and Oman of this world. And I'm concerned that some of these emerging markets are constrained a bit in the signature of the central bank, or constrained a bit in their fiscal space to maneuver, because we have not replied to this pandemic in a pan response way. We've seen a lot of non-cooperative responses, America, you know, Europe, China. And this, for me, you know, I hope, I think most of the developing economies will actually find a way to balance the health and economic arbitrage, but will be, for some of them, in a very low growth trajectory for quite some time, especially the Mexicos, the South Africa of this world, India of this world, because of, you know, the type of action they had to take. And as we discussed in, you know, as the core of this topic, as a lot of outlet markets for some of these countries that have banked everything on being a trade platform, they will be met with, you know, a lesser appetite to be a platform for outsourced jobs, or to be a platform for key supplies, right? So we need to take that into account. But you know, so some of them will be in this lower growth path. Some other emerging markets may actually face big financial headwinds. You know, we forget that capital outflow was at record level in March and April in emerging markets, and that to a certain extent, as I said before, the currency will be the revealer. So we will see a little bit what happens for some of these large emerging markets when it comes to currency movements, whether investors will have an appetite to go back, or whether they will be somehow incentivized one way or another to stay closer to home. And we already see some measures taken to incentivize this ring fencing in the financial sector. That would be very costly for emerging markets, because they benefit from the monetary and financial conditions impulsed by central banks of the North, and the financing of their growth, because of very low self-financing, and the tax revenue in Africa on average represents 16% of the budget of the countries. So they need the financial outflow to finance growth and to finance capex, right? So we need to see a little bit what's going to happen on that front, but it's going to be a tough situation in the coming months or the coming years. And so we need to continue to invent, I would say, financing platforms and regulatory or deregulatory moves to make sure that capital can continue to flow to emerging markets, because otherwise it's going to be much more difficult for them to have a proper rebound. Just look at the remittance flows that have collapsed dramatically. They are the first one to come back. So we're expecting that as the North gets better, some of these remittance flows actually will get back. But right now we are in the pit when it comes to most of the capital flows, capital inflows of the developing economies. And so it will take some time to find back these financing drivers for some of these economies, and trust and reputation will be everything. And so that's why we absolutely need to make sure that some of these countries do the right policies and avoid policy mistakes to make sure that they can be attractive for capital, but also that that their institutions can be seen as trustworthy when it comes to issuing new debt, for example, which has been a big topic, at least at the peak of the crisis, these debt arrears of some of these emerging markets, and how China could write off some of the debt. And so this is going to be an issue with us for quite some time, and we need to continue to innovate, I would say, in the type of responses we can offer to make sure that we include as many developing economies in the type of solutions we find that work for some of the countries, some of the continents that benefit from an exorbitant privilege.
Thanks. Ludovic, could I borrow maybe just 2 more minutes of your time for one more question? Okay. Tim Stuchta in Potsdam has a question that goes back to what you said about Germany within Europe. He wants to know what the effect on the single market could be, the single European market, of the fact that Germany accounts for about 50% of all of the financial and economic measures that have been taken in Europe. Would that somehow distort competition within the single market?
I think this is a big issue because we haven't really agreed on we haven't agreed on the do's and don'ts of deconfinement, right? So, and including when we talk about the 750 billion that could be put in place at the European Commission and how we're going to spend this money, we're still debating on whether we identify the windows of how this money can be dispersed and the speed of the disbursement. So the question is, we need the money to get out fast, but we don't want to have money that is used for uncooperative measures. So that's the biggest issue. Behind that is the broader issue of the richer the country, the more the bigger the support measures have been. And indeed, Germany, so people look at the fiscal measures by Germany in the wrong way sometimes. We had a discussion with your colleagues at Bruegel because they were counting stuff that is a capacity and not an actual disbursement. So Germany has been putting in place a lot of money and saying it's going to be on a demand basis, right? So all in all, it looks like Germany is doing 15 points of GDP, or it's not really that. Germany is doing close to 8-9%. The rest is basically money that is on hold and that can be used, and then there is a last pot that is guaranteed loans, because it has been a big issue. And I remember at the onset of the crisis, Italy was a bit pissed, right? Because Germany said, German public bank KfW said, we're going to put 750 billion of guaranteed loans. And then the Cassa dei Depositi in Italy said, we're going to do 750 billion too, right? And then people started to say, okay, look, Cassa dei Depositi and KfW don't have the same type of guarantees and balance sheet. And in a sense, I think Germany had to do more because Germany is needing more. But it will certainly, between those measures that have been, Germany doing even today, I would say 3 times as much as Spain, for example, and the fact that the European money will not offset completely, the net payment of the European money will not offset completely the fact that some of this money will be spent on stuff that will benefit German companies. It will definitely distort the single market, and Germany understands that. So Germany is ready to mutualize part of the fiscal input to make sure that they gain even more market shares in the monetary union. And this is, I think everybody understands that Germany was the one with the bigger rooms to maneuver. I mean, the larger fiscal space. And to be fair, also, Germany has been less affected by the virus comparatively. So it was, for example, less strict on lockdown, which made German companies faster to get after rebound, especially in manufacturing. And Germany has put in place textbook recovery. So, for example, the Konjunktur packet that was announced last week, the French are looking at this and saying, we wanted to announce it in the fall. And Germany just announced it now. And it's 4% of GDP, and it's textbook Keynesian fiscal stimulus. And in France, the debate today is we should do supply, we shouldn't do demand. So you see that, and it's going to create a huge difference because German companies have forward visibility. They know exactly they're going to get tax rebates, including on markup from lower VATs and so forth. And they're still going to get, I would say, more room to do a last tranche of stimulus later on, and that is something that will be politically will need to be politically explained by leaders in Europe, because in the past we missed that part of the explanation, which was that Germany has benefited a lot from the build-up of the euro by the de facto depreciation of the local currency. And this is why Germany needs to pay more. Now, Germany, because of the crisis, agrees to chip in more, but it comes also with strings attached. And the strings are that Germany is focusing on winning as many market outlets in Europe as possible. And therefore, we're going to have some difficult tension ahead, especially on those sectors between Germany and Italy, or between Germany and France, or between Germany and Spain, where you have, direct competition, especially on cars and manufacturing, but to a certain extent also on upstream equipment goods. And this is something that is going to be with us for quite some time. And that's why, when I say that Europe there is a balance between the French Europe and the German Europe, I'm concerned by policymakers in Germany to be upholding much less the horizontal industrial policy and the single market than before. It is a big change. People don't see that, but before, the French were going all, industrial policy, super champions, interventionism to play against the US and China. And Germany was always like, no, we need to be the beacon of hope in this state capitalism world. And now Germany just leaned towards being full-fledged interventionist, and which the business community is welcoming because of the need to repair the outlets. But this is a Frankenstein mode. We will need at one point to understand how you unplug some of these state redux, because it's going to be a big issue when some countries realize that by being bigger and by being more interventionist, Germany has an uncompetitive advantage, or at least as an exorbitant advantage that need to be offset somehow. And the Germans will not agree to offset structurally, fiscally. If you look at the budget, or at least the new budget at the European Commission level, there are two revenue streams. One is the digital tax, and the second one is the carbon tax, right? Germany will certainly chip in a bit more on the carbon tax, maybe just mechanically on the digital tax, but that's all. And this is just a size effect and nothing to really offset the fact that Germany may actually rebound a bit faster than the others. So yes, it's going to be a political discussion, and it's going to be without Chancellor Merkel. So that's the big concern right now in Germany, is to inherit a chancellor that is less of a European than Chancellor Merkel.
Well, with apologies to our patient viewers, I think that was well worth going over a couple of minutes. And I know we can't hear it, but I'm sure there's deafening applause out there virtually for really what I thought was a terrific presentation. Ludovic, thank you very much. We will post it to our AICGS website, aicgs.org. So in case you weren't able to catch all of it, you'll be able to get it there. And just as a closing thought, please stay tuned because next week we are going to be doing a podcast interview with Jörg Kukis, who is the state secretary in the German finance ministry, who has been deeply involved in
the man who saved Germany.
Exactly, that's one way of putting it, in the Franco-German proposal for a recovery plan, and so in what the European Union will be developing in the next coming months. So thank you all for joining. Thank you again, Ludovic. Really enjoyed your presentation. Hope to see you again at AICGS.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Bye to all.
Bye.